The United Nations, meantime, has warned that the world is not winning the fight against climate change. The agency's climate chief made the remarks after countries at the COP30 summit pushed through a compromise climate deal in Brazil over the weekend.
Many voiced disappointment over the outcome, which excluded new measures on fossil fuels.
We knew this COP would take place in stormy political waters. Denial, division, and geopolitics has dealt international cooperation some heavy blows this year. But friends, COP30 showed that climate cooperation is alive and kicking, keeping humanity in the fight for a livable planet with a firm resolve to keep 1.5 within reach. I'm not saying we're winning the climate fight, but we're undeniably still in it, and we are fighting back.
Experts say the agreement exposed deep divisions among countries over how climate action should be pursued, especially with America's absence from the meeting. Several nations were against ending the summit without stronger plans for reining in greenhouse gases.
Now, the deal, however, delivered on more assistance for poorer nations. Wealthy countries committed to triple climate finance for developing nations to at least $300 billion a year by 2035 to help them adapt to a warming world. Now, the deal also launched a voluntary initiative to accelerate efforts to cut emissions.
And for a closer look at the deal, let's speak to Ingi Johnstone, who's Research Fellow in Net Zero Aligned Offsetting at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford. Dr. Johnstone, thank you so much for joining us on the show this morning. So is this final deal a win or a joke? We know that Panama called it a clown show with no commitment on forests or fossil fuels, but we also know, on the other hand, it's adopted the call for more money for climate adaptation. That must count for something, no?
Absolutely. I think what's really interesting is this COP marked 10 years since the Paris Agreement had been signed and really illustrated that the devil is in the detail in terms of its implementation. And we saw that detail tested on a number of fronts. You mentioned a few, whether it's finance, whether it's protecting the tropical forest. So we've seen that that detail being tested in ways that we've not seen stress tested to this point yet. And we've seen some interesting responses. As you mentioned, not everything made it into the text, but there is an expectation and there's certain processes that the text did establish that could drive further progress in due course.
Yeah, speaking of the text, the agreement doesn't include any reference to phasing out fossil fuels. Doctor, how would that omission hit vulnerable countries? And what does petro states like Saudi Arabia's success in blocking it say about the limits of consensus-based climate diplomacy?
Absolutely. That any delay to the transition away from fossil fuels not only adds fuel to the fire, as it were, and indeed we saw an actual fire this COP in unprecedented times, but really what we can see is, as you said, these limitations of the consensus process. So we saw close to half of parties requesting a roadmap, something that again can turn the kind of rhetoric that we saw in the UAE consensus into something tangible that countries can work with and actually implement. So the lack of progress in the room has driven calls instead for a separate conference that will be held in April next year, co-hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands. And again, this represents a strong signal that if the UN system can't deliver, that other countries are going to step in to try and fill that gap. So I hope to watch that process unfold and hope that we can see some further pressure building from the sidelines there.
Dr. Johnstone, do you think there's enough climate unity, for this conference to work? I mean, will it carry the same weight, as a deal that was perhaps reached at COP30?
Well, it's an interesting question. We have seen, and indeed, as we see the G20 unfold, that actually plurilateral groups can have a really powerful impact internationally because they can help set the normative agenda. And what we really see is that at times the international agenda is desperate for kind of meaty, text to debate and actually implement. And that's a setting that we could actually see what does a just transition away from fossil fuels look like practically, both from a developed and developing country perspective. And that can go a long way in terms of bridging some of those gaps that we see historically throughout the process.
Dr. Johnstone, I want to get some understanding, if I may, on the resistance from petrostates. Very quickly, we know the idea is to get their roadmap, to make that transition over several decades. It's not going to happen next year or even in the next 5 to 10 years. So why are petrostates so resistant, if you like, to the idea?
Well, I think, it really uncovers one of the key roots in all of the kind of our fault lines that we see at COP, which is finance. And so right now, a lot of these states are, bankrolled on fossil fuels. So it's unsurprising that any roadmap to their cessation can be seen as a challenge. However, there's also this understanding globally and indeed a normative consensus around net zero. So there needs to be progress either and ideally on both reducing emissions and scaling removals. And so what's really interesting is, again, that we haven't seen that progress in implementing the UAE consensus that we could have otherwise expected. And I think more and more the world will be reluctant to accept the holdouts that we have seen, particularly from Saudi Arabia in these negotiations, but indeed other front lines related to the climate crisis.
And Doctor, we've heard a pledge to triple adaptation finance, but rich countries have a long record of promising big and delivering small. So just how meaningful is this pledge, and what, if anything, can actually compel developed countries to deliver the funds they pledged?
It's a really interesting point, and historically, when we look back, we know adaptation has long been overlooked compared to mitigation. Now, there's it's really important to unpack what levers there are to fund adaptation, and interestingly, actually, agreement was reached on one of those key levers to help fund some of that adaptation, which comes from Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So, as part of carbon trading under the Paris Agreement's new crediting mechanism, actually a 5% share of that goes to the adaptation fund to help deliver some of that work. However, we know that's not enough. We know that more bilateral and plurilateral promises and pledges need to be fulfilled. And so having some more concrete targets helps hold countries accountable to delivering that. So really, we have seen a step forward since Glasgow in this space. But again, this is just one long step in the journey to implementation.
Understood. Dr. Johnstone, Belém was also called the Indigenous Peoples COP. They left with a paragraph mentioning Indigenous rights. Were there other concrete and symbolic policy changes for them?
Well, it's really interesting to see. And I mean, what we saw on the ground at the venue actually was, we saw protests, we saw real engagement from Indigenous leaders, but also significantly engagement back from the COP presidency. So we saw them actually exit the venue and go and engage directly with Indigenous leaders. And that is unprecedented because for a long time, Indigenous groups have been overlooked as key parts of not only this process, but actually in terms of protecting the climate. So I think there has been significant step forward. However, we know that this global commitment needs practical implementation regionally and domestically, including ensuring the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous groups and local communities to the kinds of mitigation and adaptation projects that we'll see across the world.
Doctor, looking forward, with Turkey hosting COP31 next year and the U.S. expected to continue its boycott, what are the key challenges and opportunities for the next conference?
Well, it's really interesting because as we've seen tested indeed in Belém, we know that implementation requires innovation. And we've seen this innovative proposal come through between Turkey and Australia. So with Turkey leading on the host country implementation, and Australia leading on the negotiation pieces. So indeed, even that compromise is a clear signal that things aren't black and white in the journey to green, actually that there is room for some interesting compromise. So this also means that more delegates will be able to attend, less emissions will be spent in the process. However, we can also see some strong leadership from a country such as Australia in terms of that direction setting on the pathway to net zero, including both emission reductions, but also scaling removal, so the other part of net zero. So that holds a lot of promise. And what's really interesting and similar to the first Trump administration, in terms of US leadership, we've seen that shift to sub-state. So we saw a presence of, Gavin Newsom and other senators at COP in the venues, and really illustrating that commitment that they are still in to the Paris Agreement, and ultimately those kinds of partnerships and spotlighting of all the different fora that are required to actually fully implement the Paris Agreement can help take the pressure off when one party such as the US chooses to withdraw at a federal level.
Okay, Dr. Johnstone, thank you very much for your time. We've been speaking to Inji Johnstone, a research associate in net zero aligned offsetting at the University of Oxford.